So without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce to you from the University of Sheffield, Professor Dawn Watkins, Dr. Anne George, Dr. Demetra Magcuffer, and Dr. Charlotte Mills, and from Nottingham Trent University, Professor Claire Wood and Susanna Hemsley. I will now hand you over to Professor Dawn Watkins.
So thank you very much, John. Next slide, thanks, Callum. So in this presentation, I'm going to start by just going over the project aims and so on, then hand over to the team who's going to talk a little bit about the work we've done with children and young people. Claire's going to take us through the evaluation findings, and then back to me for some final reflections. And then, as John said, we hope to have some time for questions at the end. Next slide, thanks. Now, normally you do your thank yous at the end, but I wanted to get mine in at the beginning. This has been a long project and related to other projects. So I wanted to say thank you to all these people. We also have had some anonymous adult experts, so massive thanks to them as well. Next slide, thanks, Callum. So in terms of the project aims, I've taken, this is literally a cut and paste from the project grant. And basically work package 1 is building a framework of legal capability for children. What does that look like? And then based around that framework to build game-based interventions that are going to improve and also measure children's legal capability. And then work package 3 is around the evaluation work, which Claire will talk about. And then the final thing we're doing is developing a specification of how you could use our materials to build your own sort of interventions or take ours and improve them further. Next slide, thanks, Callum. So in terms of the framework, not expecting you to read that. It will be available in the project report. We have drawn on the adult literature to some extent in that we are sticking with knowledge, skills and confidence. But we have changed the approach in that it's firmly learner-centred. And we've got these 3 levels of baseline, intermediate and advanced that are incremental. And crucially, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, we are doing we put scenario definitely first. So lived experience first, law last. Next slide. Thanks, Callum. So we've drawn on a lot of theory in designing this framework. Really, in terms of this sort of incremental approach, baseline legal capability is something that is really crucial to this project. And it came through engaging with critical pedagogy and with transformative human rights education literature. Because one of the big questions we've been asking all the way through this research is how does anyone, particularly a very young child, know when their lived experience is problematic, if that's all they know as normal? And this literature really helps us to address that question. And then as I've put on the slide there, we've also taken a critical approach to law. So drawing on Lisa and Tara's work, we've decentered the law as well, which has led us to flip IRAC, which I'm going to explain a bit more about as well. So next slide, thanks. So baseline legal capability for us is like firmly situated in the child's lived experience. And the literature indicates that rights awareness, so for children, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, so that can be a light bulb moment if they are if they learn about that, but crucially have an opportunity to reflect on that in light of their lived experience. And this addresses this problem, knowing when a problem is a problem. So realizing that your subjective reality is objectively unjust. From there, basic skills are help seeking and then escalating if you don't immediately get help. Next slide, thank you. And then for all the law teachers who are here, this will make sense, but I'll need to explain it otherwise. So when we teach law to undergraduates, we teach them all about the law in general, a particular topic, and then we'll give them a problem and we say, okay, within that problem, identify the issues, identify the relevant rule, apply that rule to the issue and conclude. Now, in this project, we have flipped that the other way around. And for children, we are arguing that they need to learn the applied law. So how does the law apply to their lived experience? How does the UNCRC apply to their lived experience? They choose what to do next. And then from there, we go generic. So we're going from the specific to the general rather than the other way around. Next slide, thanks. So the easiest way to explain this is using an example from the game. So this is animated in the digital game. So this is a bullying scenario where someone's just pushing you and keeps doing that at school. Next slide, thanks. So this is, there should be a little drum roll here, because this is at the point at which our character advocate, who is an advocate, is in the game and says, not generally you have a right to be protected from harm, but specifically you have the right to be protected from being hurt by this person. So that's like the key learning for us. It's the applied legal knowledge, or the applied rights knowledge at that level. Next slide. So then children then sort of are given the opportunity in the game to decide what they do about that. So there's 4 options. They get feedback, sort of immediate feedback on that. If they don't choose the best option, they get the opportunity to try again. And then the extended learning is optional. So for baseline, young children might not go even beyond that. They might just stick with those first few questions, and that is fine for baseline. Next slide, thank you. The extended learning is then they take what advocate told them and they're given 3 sort of summary articles from the UNCRC. So it includes Article 19, which is the relevant article, and they have to match then what advocates told them to the correct article. From there, they then match that article to the source. So did it come from the UNCRC? Did it come from Parliament? Did it come from the courts? And then it's only sort of after all of that that they are encouraged to access the legal training ground. And the legal training ground includes all the stuff that you would expect almost to start in legal education. So the sources of law, where does law come from, how laws are made in Parliament, the difference between civil and criminal law. Next slide, thank you. In terms of the actual game design itself, the project started in Leicester in 2019, so ages ago, but it was interrupted by COVID for just over a year. We did mapping with a broad range of children and some storytelling with them, so that we could work out the kind of places that they go and the things that they experience. We then dropped legal scenarios into those domains, and we drew on the ACES literature to inform some of the sort of more challenging that we know children experience but wouldn't necessarily share. In Sheffield, we did a large diamond ranking exercise with children and young people to see which of the scenarios we developed are most important to them, and storyboarding to sort of get their language around how they describe these events. All the way through, we've had ideas that they were fed into our commercial developer, and all the way through, it's been sort of like feeding into the developer, then bouncing back ideas, and so on. We've been really fortunate in Sheffield to have 2 child and young people advisory boards, 1 secondary, 1 primary. And then towards the end of the project, we've recently worked with a primary and secondary children's rights ambassadors boards as well to help with the board game that we designed. And I'm just really proud that we've been managed to work across a really broad age range that you'll hear about. So from nursery right through to year 10 in secondary. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of the digital game design, like if you're in that field, the SGDA would mean something to you. So we have had that in mind in terms of the design, but that has been constrained to some extent by our own legal capability framework, but also by the literature, which is Claire's expertise on efficacy and self-determination, which privileges sort of intrinsic reward in the game rather than extrinsic reward. Next slide. So please don't go crazy and click on this straight away. This is the link to the game, law-year.com. 2 things. Well, it's suitable for all age groups. It can be played in a variety of settings, and it has audio for anything that's written, so it's suitable for young children. We are working to the nail, so we finish on the 30th of May, and the game is being improved right up until the 30th of May. So the game you click on now will be changed by the 30th, so you'll need to clear your cache after the end of the month. Next slide, thank you. And the board game is really for primary age children, sort of 7, 8 upwards, because it requires reading, and you'll see that working live in a minute in the video that we hope to show you. Next slide, Callum. So at this point, so we were fortunate, and I think Callum needs to do a bit of clicking around at this point, but we were really fortunate that we had a visit from our primary advisory board. So one of them has been with us all the way through since we started in Sheffield, and we videoed them. So we're going to show you that and then hand over to the team. So I'll be quiet now and hopefully you can see the video.
That can make a big difference, and children need to be heard, and they need to know that just because they're children that they've still got really big voices that can be heard and that can make a big difference. So in doing a project like this, they've been given a voice and they've been given opportunity to share their ideas and hopefully create something that can help other children to realise what they're capable of. They've absolutely loved it. Every time we've done the session, they've come away beaming. I think the ownership of it and the fact that they've made choices on something that they feel is really, really important. The children definitely have developed an understanding from the beginning of the project, just because they've been hearing that language more often. I think they feel a little bit more confident now. Before they might have heard it but not felt confident to use it in context. We've had conversations in our PSHE lessons where the advisory board have been able to speak to the children kind of as advisors.
Well, I think it's really important that children are involved in the ideas, the look, the feel, everything about the game, because at the end of the day, the game is for them and it's about getting them engaged and excited and being able to present the world in a way that is understandable, because it's so different to the kind of grown-up world. And they have some great ideas. One of the things that we also tried to think about with the game was about how the game's structured, so that it's the right amount of length. You can kind of dip in and out of it. You kind of come back to that sort of central board with the pin board in front of you and the bits kind of going. So we really tried to make sure it's something that would suit being played in a class, being played at home, being played with groups of people, being played on your own.
I think it's so important how children are impacted, especially in today's society. They have a lot more power than they're actually recognised as having currently. I think they're becoming so much more aware of their surroundings, of how life can affect them, and of how powerful they are as individuals as well. That this is really empowering them, and they can actually see that they have these rights and that they can be protected.
Okay, so I think we'll just wait for the videos to finish, and thanks, Carl. So I'd now like to hand you over to our colleague Susanna Helmsley from Nottingham-Trent University for the next slide.
Hi, so I'm Susanna and I worked with the very young children in the development of this game. So they're the children that are nursery age and the foundation year at primary school. There were quite a few challenges that came with working with children this young, far too many to name. But I've got a couple of quotes on my slide here. And I think the first one just highlights that even very young children, they do understand when something is wrong. So this child was presented with the scenario where they were being pushed over at school. I think this child was about 3 years old at the time. And he said, oh, well, that's not very kind, which kind of highlights that children, they can understand, because I think we can often think that maybe they don't understand things like this at such a young age, but absolutely they certainly can. Another quote here is from a child when asked if there were any other adults that could help him in a difficult situation. He pointed out that a dad is someone that can help, even though this child stated they didn't have a dad. They are aware that a dad is someone that can help. So again, this quote just kind of highlights that children, they are aware that there are certain adults around that they can go to if they need help. I will hand you over to my colleague, Anne, now. Next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. I want to share my experience of working with broccoli all of our participants had fruit or vegetable names for anonymity, and hence the name broccoli. Broccoli was a non-verbal 5-year-old research participant. Looking back, I remember his happiness in participating. In the photo here, you can see the game he created about UNCRC articles. He was using Play-Doh to create the article numbers and using the pipe cleaner to point to the numbers. So together, we created this snake with its very flexible tail that remembers UNCRC articles. It was such a joy to work with Broccoli. I will now hand over to Dimitra. Next slide, please.
Hello from me. So a really special part of this project, I was working directly with children and young people to co-design both the measures and the lawyer game. So from the start, we committed to designing with them and not just for them, and that made all the difference. From the very beginning of the project, we partnered with schools across Sheffield to form advisor groups. So the course you see here today came from that stage where we presented 4 different game concepts and asked for the feedback, what felt exciting or what caught their attention. So what really stood out was how they approached the task. They considered what would make the experience exciting and relatable for players of their age. And these comments reflected an enthusiasm for mystery, movement, and discovery. So their feedback shaped the direction of the game, and even small details like the desk were seen as a fun idea, reminding us how even background elements can enhance engagement. So the whole process has been rewarding and has been a clear reminder of the value of listening closely to young people and not treating them not as passive participants, but as active co-creators throughout the design process. So a huge thank you to all of them for being such brilliant collaborators for our project. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Charlotte. Next slide, please, Callum.
So we also worked with children and young people on the content of our scenarios. For example, when working with teenagers to discuss our neglect scenario, this young person said the scenario particularly resonated with them as they had experienced something similar at home. And because of their experience, they equated formal help like Childline with the system, which for them had negative consequences. And it was discussions like these which helped us not to take their perceptions and lived experiences for granted. In this instance, the conversation sparked a discussion on the language and phrasing that we use. For example, saying an adult you trust rather than name or imply specific forms of help. We learned to recognise that help seeking doesn't have to be specific or formal, and it's the act of seeking help that's important. I'm going to hand over to Claire now. So next slide, please, Callum.
Hi, yeah, my name's Claire Wood, and my role on this project was to help with the evaluation aspect of this. So having developed the game, obviously it's really important for us to determine how successful it's actually going to be in practice, and also the best context in which it can be used. So we approached that in 2 ways. We had a qualitative case study approach for when we were working with the youngest children, so the 3 to 6 year olds. And this was because we really wanted to involve them at an earlier stage in the development of the game, and to work with them in a slightly more kind of age appropriate and gentle way. So we still explored their confidence and their knowledge and their skills in relation to, as Dawn was talking about earlier on, whether or not they could recognise whether or not a problem was apparent and what to do about it. But we did that at an earlier stage, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. We then had a larger scale quantitative evaluation that was a little bit more formal. It was a pre-post randomized control study that we originally designed it to be to lean into kind of more of a realist evaluation style approach. So a realist evaluation is concerned with understanding what works for whom and under what circumstances. So from that point of view, we were really interested in trying to capture a broad sample so that we could look at different types of children. We could look at different sort of settings, so different geographical areas, different types of school context or home context. And we also looked at the way in which the digital game in particular could be implemented. So from that point of view, we had 4 comparisons that we were interested in. So we obviously had, if you like, a group of children who were doing what they normally do at school, and they acted as a control group. We also had a group who were using the game in the context of a PSHE lesson, where the game was shared with them on an interactive whiteboard at school. There was another group who were playing the game on their own at home, unsupervised, and there was a third group who were playing the game freely, but in the context of being at school. So it wasn't part of a structured lesson as such, but it was still being done under the supervision of school teachers. We evaluated the impact of the game through 3 assessments. We wanted to know if their knowledge of the law and of the UNCRC had increased, so we had a knowledge test. We wanted to know if they felt, if there was a development of their kind of understanding of knowing what to do, so if you like, their skills, whether or not that would improve, and that was assessed through the development of a situational judgment test. And then finally, we also had what we called the Children's Rights and Confidence Questionnaire, and this was a questionnaire that assessed children's, in particular, sort of sense of self-efficacy, so the extent to which they felt confident and capable of acting on their rights. Next slide, please, Carl. So initially, we recruiting schools has proved to be kind of one of the biggest challenges of the project, and those of you who do school-based work will not be surprised by this. We initially attempted a cascade type approach where we approached heads of multi-academy trusts and tried to recruit schools that way. It was fairly heavy going. What we ended up with in the end is we ended up with 6 schools who ran the complete quantitative evaluation, and we published the protocol and so on for the study on the Open Science Framework before we began the study. We mainly assessed the children's knowledge, skills and confidence through digital versions of the assessments. In one case, the school wanted to do that as a paper-based measure, so they were simply transferred to a paper-based measure for that. And what we had is we had around 400 responses that we were able to analyse from that. So not as large scale as we originally wanted or intended, but certainly enough to have some initial evidence of whether or not the gameplay was effective. Next slide, please, Karen. Right, so let's start off with the tiny ones. So as I mentioned, we did have a more qualitative approach for the children who were in early years. So we had 15 3 to 6-year-olds who were working with Susanna and Dimitra, and we adopted more of a case study approach to examine whether or not there was any evidence that contact with the game was improving their knowledge, skills and confidence. Now, we assess knowledge, skills and confidence in a slightly different way in this age group. So rather than do formal assessments or psychometrics, we took more of a activity-based approach to, if you like, interviewing the children so that we could get a sense of what they knew and where their confidence was. So we had 3 activities for them. And these were spread over a number of sessions. So the first activity was called Who Helps Me? And this was simply sitting down with the children and saying, if you were feeling worried, who would you go to for some help? And we'd encourage the children to draw pictures of the people that they felt could help them and to talk to us as they were doing those drawings. And then we would ask them, well, if that person for some reason wasn't able to help you, who else could you go to? And that was to assess the sense of whether or not they knew how to escalate if they weren't getting the support that they needed. But that first one is really about identifying the people that they saw as trusted adults. In the second session, we used an activity called the Tricky Situation, and we shared with the children some simple drawings that illustrated 3 situations. So one was the case of a child that didn't have enough to eat. We had another one where a child was being bullied. We had another drawing of a child who'd hurt themselves because park equipment was faulty. And we asked the children in this situation, if this happened to you, where would you go for help? How easy would it be for you to talk to that person? And if they couldn't help you, who would you go to next? In the final activity, we had a simple activity, which was, is it okay? And this was about thinking about different behaviours and whether or not different behaviours were acceptable. And so the idea was we'd give them a prompt, and that might be something like, you're allowed to eat sweets every day. Is that okay? And the children would have 3 boxes in front of them, and it would be a box indicate that either it was an okay thing to do, it wasn't okay, or they weren't sure if it was okay or not. And they'd put a card in the corresponding box. And so the idea was that through these activities, we would try and encourage the children to talk to us a little bit, but certainly at the simplest level, the children could indicate to us through their drawings and through the placement of cards where their knowledge and understanding and confidence lay. So we did those games with them initially, and then they engaged with up to 8 weeks of gameplay with a beta version of the game. So this is when the game was still in development. And then after those sessions, we then repeated the assessment task with as many of the children as we could. Next slide, please. And what we found was 60% of the children that we worked with did show an improvement on their knowledge, skills and confidence activities that we did with them. And the field notes that were compiled at the time showed that it was the children who were engaged with the game who also seemed to show the biggest improvement, which was quite encouraging. And what seemed to be really, really critical was that it was that repeated gameplay. It was allowing the children in this age group to have repeated attempts at playing the same activities seemed to be really important in helping to cement that knowledge and understanding. As Susanna alluded to, we had a whole bunch of issues working with this age group. Initially, because it was the beta version of the game, we had a little bit of glitching, and what we found quite quickly was the children in this age group, they've got very limited tolerance for that, so it really impacted their enthusiasm to engage with the game where that happened. We also noted that where many of the children lacked a lot of experience with using these types of devices, they needed a little bit more support and guidance. So often they would have coordination difficulties in terms of the swiping or interacting with the game, or they just might need a little bit of adult support with the navigation. We also found that children in this age group were very easily distracted by visual and audio features of the game rather than attending to the storytelling. So that was something that we had to take back to the games developers at that stage. And we also encouragingly found that the game mechanics did seem to be having a positive impact on the children's interest and motivation. So from this initial stage, not only did we get some sense that the game had potential to be successful with very young children, albeit with adult support, but we also knew we were on the right track. Next slide, please, Carl. Excellent. So on to the drum roll piece. In terms of looking at the school-age children, the older children, we were interested in obviously knowing whether or not the game could improve the children's knowledge, skills and confidence. We wanted to know what implementation contexts were most effective. And we were interested to see if we could see if there were any differences in terms of which children were benefiting from playing the game. So as I mentioned earlier on, we had tried to get quite a broad range, but we were also interested in larger subgroups, like whether or not there are any evidence of any gender effects. So in the end, we ended up with around 280 primary school children and about 140 secondary school children. We are still waiting for some of the secondary school children's data to come back. So the secondary school data is still a work in progress, but I'm going to share with you what we have so far. Next slide, please. Okay, so the good news is overall, we saw that the game was successful in improving knowledge of their rights in the law and improving their performance on the situational judgment test. So you can see here, the orange bars on the right are the represent the improvement in scores from the intervention group compared to the degree of improvement from pre to post test in scores from the control group. So the effect sizes here are quite decent. So for knowledge, the effect size was in the region of 0.54, and on skills, the effect size was 0.45. Now, there wasn't a discernible impact of the gameplay on the children's confidence, but that we think might be because actually at baseline, the children's scores on the confidence measure were pretty high. And so there wasn't an awful lot of room for them to go. So that, I think that's what we were seeing there. But you see, there was a modest increase, but not one that was statistically significant. Just to add that we analysed these data using an analysis of covariance to determine if the average treatment effect was significant. So now by that we mean we were interested in knowing what the effect of the intervention was for the average child in a given sample. Okay, next slide, please. When we look at knowledge in particular, you'll remember we were interested in the different contexts, and what we found was that you saw the best and the significant improvement in knowledge scores either when the children were using the game in the context of a structured lesson via an interactive whiteboard with their teacher, or when they were engaging in free play at school. We didn't find a significant improvement when they were playing the game independently at home. And so those children didn't outperform the controls. And that would seem to be largely because, again, that freedom to play at home, they weren't necessarily getting engaging with the game for the same amount of time. So if you like, the dose was reduced for those children. But where the children were playing it and we knew that they were playing it for a decent amount of time, we saw the improvements in knowledge. Next slide, please. Again, similar story with skills, but here what we found was that the improvement in the situational judgment test scores was associated with playing the game independently at school. So that second set of bars that you can see in front of you. So none of the other contexts were found to significantly improve skills. So again, so far what we're seeing is that allowing children to play the game freely, but at school, where there's a little bit of school supervision, that seems to give us good outcomes. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, in terms of confidence, we weren't seeing a huge significant effect. The scale on these slides is slightly deceptive. They look slightly more impressive than they actually were. What you will notice, though, is that the group of children who were playing the game freely at home, if anything, their confidence declined a little bit from pre to post. So that, like I say, I think it's largely an artifact of the fact that the children were scoring very highly initially. And then I think in the other context, they had, at school, they had adults there to help them contextualize what they were learning in the game in a way that maybe the children who were playing the game at home didn't have that. But I think what we're largely seeing here is a little bit of a ceiling effect. But yeah, but we didn't have an effect on the children's confidence through the gameplay. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're still awaiting some data from the secondary school children. So the bars here are a little bit squiffy because we're dealing with quite small samples. But what you can see straight away is interesting with the secondary school children, we're seeing a slightly different pattern of results. We're seeing that we're seeing a strong improvement compared to controls on their performance on the skills measure, on the situational judgment test. We're also seeing an effect on confidence in the secondary school children that we didn't see in the younger children, who I guess may be overestimating their confidence. but we haven't seen an impact on knowledge. So again, we need to dig into this a little more, but it may be with these older children, then knowledge is kind of, again, there's potentially perhaps a little bit less room for growth in relation to that. Okay, next slide, please. And I'll hand over to Dawn or John for this final slide.
It's me. Thank you, Claire. Yes, so the reason we kind of put mission complete question mark is because I think Claire and I would both say like we're really pleased with what we've managed to achieve in the project, but we very much want this to be sort of something that other people take on and take further. So the whole approach from the beginning has been that we will license the digital game and the board game openly for use and for further development. So the digital game has been created in open source software to facilitate that. The plan, I'm just in discussions with the teams at Sheffield at the moment about how to actually make that happen. I think it will be in the data repository under some sort of free licensing system. One thing we have got an opportunity to do, but not yet the funding, if anyone has got lots of spare money, we would like to translate the game into 4 different languages for use with children who are asylum seeking or refugee children, because we think it could work really well for them as a sort of introduction to coming new into the country and finding out about their legal rights and their rights under the convention. And I also mentioned that when I put the link up, so those, I know some of you have had problems joining, so thanks for messaging me, because I've been furiously sending links out to people. So apologies that some of you have had problems joining. But the digital game is www.lord-yeah.com. And we are just working, again, from feedback from children and young people, we're just doing some final improvements to the game. So you can access it at the moment, but between now and the 30th of May, there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. So after the 30th of May, the game will change slightly. So there will be some added complexity, which we'll think will make it more challenging for the older players. But really, yeah, just to say that we really welcome new partnerships with, there's a few people that we've already been in touch with in terms of how they might be able to take on what we've done and progress it further. But from my point of view, you know, I'm really hoping that we can push for the digital game to be used in schools, particularly with very young children, as a means to sort of really highlighting for them their legal rights and their rights under the convention. So we are beautifully on time, so I think that we can hand over to hear from everybody else now and some questions. And apologies again to those of you, can see Maggie's just flagged a comment, and I know that some of you have had problems, so thanks for bearing with us.